My name is Erica Marat. I am a professor at the National Defense University, and I just wrote a book on policing in former Soviet states. The title is The Politics of Police Reform, Society Against the State in Post-Soviet Countries. So the main question I try to answer in my book is, what does it take to reform a post-Soviet police force? Because it seems like in countries like Ukraine, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, there have been some democratic developments, very vibrant civil society activism, free media, free and fair elections. However, police are one of the few institutions that are barely touched by reforms since the dissolution of the Soviet regime. And if anything, including in countries like Ukraine, police are even more predatory, even more closed from society, and even more corrupt. So here I was asking, what does it take to reform a post-Soviet police force? Institutions like police that are able to control political dissent, control mass protests, and be loyal to the political regimes will not be changed by political leaders, even if they are democratically elected. The change will not come from inside, not from the Interior Ministry and post-Soviet Interior Ministries have learned to survive on their own by collecting bribes, even survive without state subsidies. And the change will not come from within. So international efforts that focus on working with political leaders, with interior ministries, they will not yield much result. It's much easier for political leaders to continue the status quo, to continue to rely on loyalty of police officers on the street and in the leadership ranks, and to maintain the police as was inherited from the Soviet regime. The long answer is that there needs to be resistance in the society to change the way policing is conducted on an everyday basis and during extraordinary situations. The puzzle with Ukraine was when I visited Kyiv in just 2 weeks before Euromaidan protest, I saw that there had been already an extremely diverse civil society activism. There were NGOs that worked with different demographics to teach them how to deal with police if they're unlawfully detained. There were individual activists who had traumatic experiences with police, and they tried to change the way policing is conducted. And then there were also ad hoc movements, more spontaneous movements of drivers in larger cities that challenged traffic police and resisted paying bribes, and instead revealed by videotaping, revealed how police officers themselves very often break the law. So the resistance was there already before Euromaidan protest. And of course, as we saw bloodshed and really unimaginable brutality during Euromaidan demonstrations, conducted by the militarized wing of the Interior Ministry, the Interior troops, there was nothing but commitment from the new leadership, led by Poroshenko, to pledge to commit a police reform program in Ukraine in order to prevent any further outbreaks of violence as we saw during Euromaidan. And here we see that this pre-existing civic activism was really helpful to direct the priorities for what changes needed to be made within the Interior Ministry. the discussion of what needs to be changed, how things need to change, what kind of police Ukrainian society needs, was really robust, diverse, and energetic in the days following the Euromaidan revolution. Police reform is not a set of projects. It's not going to happen fast. So when I see fast change in policing, like what we saw in Georgia after the election of Saakashvili, or what followed shortly after Euromaidan as well in Ukraine, that we saw a creation of an entirely new police force, really beautiful people, very well dressed, and so on. So when I see the change happening very fast and is driven top down, it's really concerning, because that means that the diversity of opinions, the diversity of demands coming from bottom up are not really incorporated into the change. Real deep police change in policing is slow, it's chaotic, and has many different competing voices that need to come with a consensus. So coming back to Ukraine, what we saw was there was a strong opposition to the way policing was conducted. Those voices were extremely loud after Euromaidan. Poroshenko promised reform for some time. Those voices were listened to. But then the efforts to reform police were hijacked by Interior Ministry, the leadership, with the help of Georgian experts who became Ukrainian citizens. And it became, again, a top-down initiative. And a lot of the expertise that exists in the civil society community was sort of pushed aside, marginalized. But I hope that this will change in Ukraine, and it did change in Georgia as well after Saakashvili's party was voted out of power, for instance. That the discussion again becomes multifaceted, and we'll have more voices in the in the design of what kind of police we need. And we saw similar developments in Kyrgyzstan as well after the regime change in 2010. There was again a vibrant discussion and some elements of very slow but deep change in how police relate to the society. I'm thinking of change in how police relate to the society and what the society expects police officers do in everyday life. And that type of change takes a long time. It is a result of heated discussions on multiple forums in the media, in courts, in the parliament, and so on. To give you an example, you can see here in the United States, where I live, there is a vibrant national discussion on how Black communities need to be policed. With the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, we see how there is a resistance, bottom-up resistance to the type and the extent of violence used against African American men and women. So the change is coming. It's very slow, and there is less force used against those communities. So similar type of change is happening in former Soviet states. It's just it is not measured in externally funded projects, and they're usually helpful, but they're not the biggest factor in how police transform. It is really the society trying to work with the Interior Ministry on different levels by consulting them, by participating in joint forums, by creating oversight mechanisms, by just citizen reporting of different police misconduct. This is the type of change I'm talking about, and we see it happen in Ukraine but it is at a much slower pace, and it's a lot more difficult to measure than those externally funded projects, the new police cars and uniforms and so on. So corruption is omnipresent in any police functions in Ukraine, and Ukraine is not the only example. It's a norm. It's a norm. Corruption is a norm across interior ministries in former Soviet countries, and many other countries as well, including sometimes United States. So citizens pay bribes to avoid interaction with police officers. Police officers press for bribes to to extort money from sometimes wealthy businessmen to stop prosecuting them and so on, to help them protect their businesses. So it's everywhere. There is no, lack of corruption is more of an exception, and corruption is the norm. The difference with interior ministries and individual police officers is that, unlike, for instance, teachers or doctors or any other bureaucrats, police officers can actually use force, and legitimate force, arguably legitimate force, to extort corruption or threaten with jail time if an individual does not take a bribe. So this is a problem. However, the core of the reform of any police reform in former Soviet countries is not so much eradicating corruption, because corruption is omnipresent. It's not only interior ministry, it's everywhere. It's part of life. But it is about limiting situations where police would be able to legitimately use violence, and in creating oversight mechanisms over the police's uses of violence, because that's use of violence is one. It's the most important feature that sets interior ministries apart from other public institutions. And when those mechanisms are created, we will hopefully also see less bribery and just fewer cases of forceful extortions of bribes, of payments, illegal payments to police. So when I walked around with police officers in Kyiv, the new ones, the ones that were recruited after Euromaidan, one of their biggest frustration was that the judicial system is really undermining, or prokuratura is really undermining their efforts. So they can, for instance, arrest and put into detention a drunk driver, and then they see that same driver driving again because he was able to get out of the detention facility by bribing or by using his political influence. And then if police officers come up with charges against certain individuals, then they can again be undermined. Their efforts can be undermined and are often undermined by courts and so on. So you can't just reform police forces without reforming courts and the judicial system in general. It has to happen alongside. But we should also not expect a quick change. I think there was a false promise early on after Euromaidan protests that by hiring a whole new labor force, a whole new police officer contingent, that the change would take place. It will percolate to other parts of government, including the judicial system. And as hopeful and optimistic as those promises sounded, and I really sympathize with the activists, especially some reformist in the government in Ukraine, they're quite naive, and this is not how things happen. I think the biggest surprise compared to other parts of the former Soviet space, Ukrainian civil society activists have a really sophisticated understanding of the type of police reforms needed for Ukraine, that they don't necessarily, those reform programs don't necessarily need to follow, foreign examples, US example or Canadian or even some European countries, but the change needs to be implemented to reflect the complexity of a Ukrainian population, and police forces need to be depoliticized, demilitarized, respect human rights, respect diversity in the society. And those ideas, and I'm not doing any justice by just summarizing those ideas are extremely well developed, solidified in the civil society circles. And it is up to the government to listen to those voices or find them to be too ambitious and too complicated and just continue with the status quo. So the comparison is that, unfortunately, that the gap between democratic gains and most other aspects of life in Ukraine, like again, elections, civil society activism, media, and so on, is so wide. If you compare it to the judicial system. So it is really abnormal for other parts of the former Soviet space to see such a gap exist. If you look at Georgia, the judicial sector, the police are a little more advanced in their reforms, and they also have a very vibrant civil society. And in other countries where you don't have reforms in the judicial sector, you also don't have a vibrant civil society. So Ukraine strikes me as this very peculiar country where the gap is so wide between unreformed judicial sector, police, and perhaps many other governance, government agencies, and the strength of civil society activists. A lot of money was invested into recruiting new police officers in the first couple of years after Euromaidan. United States, US government, Canadian government, Japan, European Union, they were the main funders. Tens of millions of dollars were invested in uniforms, new cars, and new trainings and new labor force within Interior Ministry. But this is not sustainable, and it is really difficult. So on the one hand, it's easy to recruit a new labor force. It's harder to deal with what you have already, the Interior Ministry, the 300,000 police officers that are already there. And on the other hand, it's hard to keep up with the same level of spending. So in a way, it was really unfortunate that so much money was invested in such short period of time to then face the reality that perhaps all those new recruits will also have to succumb to corruption or will be demoralized because of lack of funding. If there is deeper reform within the Interior Ministry, and one of the ways to do that is to invite, again, I'm repeating myself, I sound like a broken record, but invite activists who have been pressuring Interior Ministry for years now to implement changes, to invite them into the Interior Ministry, to have them work on new programs, reform programs, and to oversee those reform programs. So to kind of outsource that to non-governmental experts that are so that are so professional already and and are also very driven. Well, what I would do is, first of all, I would not make it my responsibility to implement change as an outsider, but I would invite the dozen or even 24 existing experts who often disagree with each other on what needs to happen within the Interior Ministry. I would form a type of working group with those experts, with Interior Ministry officials, with parliamentarians, and with maybe representatives of the president's administration, and have them work on a specific program to implement change step by step, to see how can police be depoliticized, made a more accountable, less violent to the population. What are the mechanisms that need to be installed in everyday work of the police officers, of police leadership, so that there is more service, less violence to the population? And the process will be messy. The process of debating a program like this will be messy. It will be long. It's probably going to be emotional, but in the end, it's going to be a much deeper and more lasting change to policing, as opposed to just some of projects implemented by external organizations. So all of the countries that have been more democratic compared to the rest have seen more change, and that includes Ukraine, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, partly Armenia, partly a little bit of, somewhat little bit in Kazakhstan. We see some change. But the bottom line is the post-Soviet states, they inherited such a robust, consolidated police institution of police from the Soviet regime, that it is a lot more difficult to undo it compared to other government agencies, and it's a challenge, and it's it will take maybe another decade or two to really match what the police can do to protect liberties, protect democratic processes of post-Soviet societies. When they go to elections, when they protest political regimes, when they try to just go with their day-by-day activity without fear from being prosecuted. Well, no, police in Russia, and there is a lot of, the reason why I didn't include Russia in my book, because there has been already a lot written about Russia. It's it is a continuation of Soviet type policing, with some elements of capitalist, capitalist way of behaving, that police are really not shying away from taking bribes from entrepreneurs, from the population, and are really self-sufficient, self-funded in that way. There are no checks and balances. There are no oversight mechanisms over policing in Russia, and it's quite politically loyal to the regime. There are some exceptions, of course, everywhere, but overall, this is the picture. There are so many encouraging signs. There is a huge outburst of citizen reporting, citizens' participation in monitoring day-to-day activities of policing through dash cameras, on the cars, to just openly talking to police officers on the street about rights, about political issues, about public safety, and sometimes helping the police to do their job. We see this happen mostly in urban areas across across Ukraine, across Georgia and Kyrgyzstan and Moldova, where the citizens are really feeling the responsibility to protect themselves from illegal activity by police, and at the same time help police to do their jobs better. And I think this is a sign of a maturing civil society, maturing democratic environment, democratic society, and it's not going to be undone. It will continue to accelerate, and Ukraine is a good example of this dynamic. In Kyiv, you see people who directly participated in removing bodies, those injured in Euromaidan, and every time they talk about it, they kind of cry, they become so emotional, and it was a transformative event of their lives, and they want to see near Ukraine. At the same time, you can go to a store not too far away from Maidan, and there you would meet a person who just, the whole transformation just went by them. It did not really touch their souls, their minds, and they're just going on living their everyday lives. And that's okay. That's okay. I think it's a normal reaction in a society, in any society. I think what's important is that change doesn't happen rapidly. Sometimes there are outbursts of change, such as in the aftermath of shocking events like Euromaidan, that more people are affected by it. Other times it takes half a generation to go through a change. When I was in Kyiv 2 weeks before Euromaidan, one of the political experts told me that we should not, and that was the height of authoritarianism of Yanukovych regime, right? You couldn't even access Maidan during rush hour because it was all blocked for him to move around the city. It was pretty frustrating. But one of the experts I interviewed, he told me change is not coming, because the population, and that's his words, the population is a collective of Yanukovych. So the mindset and the population is that they are the Yanukovych, and it was sort of sad to hear that, but at the same time, change did happen, and it did begin 2 weeks after that interview. So it is happening. The answer is change is happening. It's hard to measure it, and it might be slow. I'm repeating myself, but it might be slow. Sometimes it is faster, but it is there. It's definitely happening. It's definitely happening. If you compare Ukraine to year 2000 or 2001, 10 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, to 2011, those are completely different societies to my mind. I want to also remind your listeners that there were really significant attempts made by different groups in the population to change policing, predatory policing, in the aftermath of shocking events such as rape by police officers in Mykolaiv, the rape of several women, and then murder of those women. So there has been mobilization of the bottom-up resistance to policing. And I think those were really precursor events to greater demonstrations that eventually led to the ouster of Yanukovych. So even though things before Yanukovych looked kind of stagnating and slow, a lot of changes were already happening on the ground, and the society is very resilient, and I think the push will continue, and eventually we will see that the way police relate to the society will also change in Ukraine. Well, research of essentially bottom-up resistance to the status quo, to policing in former Soviet states, really made me think about other examples across the world where we see how systemic violence by states, by police forces, is resisted by civil society groups, by society at large. And I'm now looking at Black Lives Matter in the United States, how they're challenging the judicial system and policing in the US. I'm looking at Mexico, the mobilization of civil society activists in the aftermath of disappearance of 43 students in 2014. It was a shocking event for society in Mexico. And also looking at India, how there is a groundswell of resistance against violence against women after a deadly rape in Delhi in 2012. So research of policing and resistance to policing in former Soviet states really furnished me with the right type of knowledge and analytical tools to try to understand somewhat similar dynamics in other parts of the world as well. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your questions. It's a lot better to be aware of things, through research as opposed to just kind of not really understanding what's happening. I think you're doing such a service to diaspora, to Ukraine, and just and Ukrainian studies, and also I guess East European studies. It's such a treat. I think you're doing an amazing job. I wish there were more people like that who would invest their time into doing this, because it takes a lot of work